Good morning. Excuse me. Good morning. I can't claim that the internet is the first person I've talked to today, so I don't know what that was, but So, good morning, Facebook and YouTube. And if I take this moment, we're going to say hi to Instagram as well. Today, I'm excited. This is my first part two conversation. Now, a lot of this is probably going to be going more into my program and the projects I've been working on behind the scenes. But I feel like for anyone tuning in, hopefully y'all can kind of keep up with the main points that I'm going to make because they're really not. I mean, they're complicated. Don't get me wrong. Like all the stuff about mental health and the brain and relationships is complicated. I try to find simple ways to approach them or to reframe our perspective. Get it? Yeah, perspective is my life. I have it tattooed on me. So if you can really only see it in the mirror, or I can only see it in the mirror because it is that reflection of ourselves. So when people come to therapy and to come, work on their mental health, a lot of it is really confronting themselves. So the topic today being confrontation culture part two. So I'm excited it's part two just because it's such an expansive conversation. I can take my best interpretation of black and white information and boil it down, but every person's situation is different, and then every person has a different experience each time that we try to apply this information. So today I really kind of want to give an overview on like how do you have those hard confrontation conversations. They're uncomfortable. As a therapist, what maybe something that I'm trained in that you guys can work on to kind of help you with those conversations. Uh, but I'll tell you, as a therapist, it doesn't exclude me from being uncomfortable when I have the conversations, not only with my clients, but with in my own personal life. I still had to practice very intentionally. And there's a main point for you. You have to bring intention into your life in everything that you do, while also realizing what influences your intention at the same time. That's why therapy is, I tell my clients, it's a full-time job on top of a full-time job and trying to maintain your livelihood. So, but we're going to talk a little bit about what goes into those hard conversations and kind of as a therapist, right? Like I kind of see, I have like an insider insight of, insider trading of what people are going through and what are some of the more common issues that people get hung up on when you're trying to have these conversations. So we're going to talk a little bit about triggers, we're going to talk a little bit about shame, and we're going to talk a little bit about boundaries. Again, disclaimer, these are really big topics. There are a lot to unpack, not only just to learn about them. So if this is the first time that you're learning about any of these things, then I would caution you to kind of sit with the information. Try not to do much with it right now. Try to mull it over. But if you do have a lot of confrontations, you may not feel like you have a lot of time to mull it over, but I can guarantee you have time because there's going to continuously be time, hopefully, if you're not getting yourself into any high risk behaviors or situations. So let's get started. I have a couple people, one of my favorite people, watching from Instagram. And a couple people on YouTube and Facebook. For my people on Instagram, if you want, there's a kind of a different experience on YouTube. If I'm going live on YouTube, it's really just because we're sitting in like a virtual therapy office, whereas on what is this, Instagram, you're kind of just seeing me on my other phone and just going live. So hi. So let's get started. Confrontation culture, the part one I did was a little bit more geared. Hold on one second, I gotta turn my fan on because I'm already hot. TJ, you're gonna have to move off. My cat is laying on the cord of the fan and he gives absolutely no F's about it. He's like, are you moving something that I'm laying on? Yeah. Yes, I am because I'm hot. See, I have a purpose. We're gonna have a confrontation right now, TJ. Okay. He's gazing out the window. It's like such an entitled cat. I love cat. We'll talk about the psychoanalysis of feline behavior another time. That's kind of a fun topic I love to talk about. So, but with confrontation culture, the first part one I did, I believe I talked a little bit more about what I think we talked a little about the THINK acronym. And I just feel like it's a really good tool or a blueprint for people to kind of go through the reflection of like when you have to have a tough conversation with someone, you have to confront someone on something. What is an approach that can be like a little bit of the checks and balances? So today I want to get into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes, some things that like they have tools associated with them, but they're not always going to be the easiest things to decipher. I think if I had to give you the biggest tool here, actually, I just recently posted it on my story. Is that one of the biggest life lessons that I've had to do is like I can read a textbook. Actually, I read a lot of them. I have a bunch of books that I've read, skimmed. You do not truly learn that information. And in my opinion, you don't become a subject matter expert until you apply it, you practice it. And then if you're a professional, you have two places that you practice it. You practice it with your clients, and then you also can practice it in your life. And yes, I took it a bit further. I'm not saying that you can't be good at what you do just because you don't practice what you preach, but I can tell you sure as hell there's going to be a limitation in what you learn about what you know when you actually experience it yourself. So having hard conversations, a lot of times these can get put off in other ways. One of the more common ways, which is this is not really I'm not going to grade any certain way to have these conversations, but if you're having text conversations, this can be kind of, there's some pros and cons with that, right? Because when you text something, it's good for the person expressing themselves to be able to figure, okay, this is what I want to say. For the most part, it's concise, but I would challenge you to, if you can edit your own conversation, do so, because what happens in terms of someone receiving that, and if this is a person that's actually very open, who's very, balanced, let alone someone who's not, who's known for being more reactive, who's known for taking things more personally, you're losing so much of your tone, so much of your presentation. And part of why I mentioned why it's difficult to have these conversations and you have to practice what you preach and knowing these things is you have to make the mistakes of knowing what is an appropriate and effective way to have tough conversations. Text conversations, especially in this day and age, we have all become, I even have them, but I really try not to. And I don't always have to do the hard thing. That's something that I chose, and that's part of transformation is you have to choose harder things sometimes in order for you to really gain the experience to balance your mental health out. Because I'll tell you, from a chemical level, when you put yourself intentionally, there's that word again, intentionally in a place of stress and you actually accomplish that and you get through it and you're stressed out, and then you have the option, or not the option, but the opportunity to use the skills that you do learn more in therapy. But hopefully if you've been watching my content, you know that skill is the box breathing technique. You have to escalate your central nervous system. But when you put yourself intentionally in stressful situations, then you produce natural releases of hormones that improve your mental health. So in clinical terms, we call this eustress, EUSTRESS, like euphoria, like eustress. So you actually get and you reap a reward naturally by having hard conversations in a way where you've made mistakes. You have to make mistakes. So this is where a lot of people, so let's talk about triggers, right? When we're talking about confrontation, we're talking about, it's a big responsibility. First and foremost, let me remind you all of that. This is not an easy thing to do. But the more that you avoid confrontations, the more you actually take on, you're mentally and emotionally responsible, because you may not be processing it consciously. You might have to be like, whatever, it is what it is. I'm done with it. That person's just gonna feel whatever they feel. But you're compartmentalizing, and you're actually causing yourself more harm, because that's energy you have to use to store that information. Right? I see it all the time, and I've also done it myself, because I never having hard conversations, especially when you have really challenging people who sometimes have a lot of narcissistic traits. Sometimes now, let me pause here for a moment. This is not to say if you have someone that you're in an abusive relationship with that you need to go have this conversation. No, if you feel like you're at a threat for your life, your safety, and you have more proof than not, because you're not doing the same thing, to have a conversation differently with someone, then yes, I'm saying have those hard conversations. But if you have proof that this person is going to if you're doing something different, if your approach to the hard conversation and the confrontation is different, then more than likely you will get a different result. But this also takes practice. So when you're navigating someone's triggers, you're also now have to be aware of your own, and you have to be aware of other people's to a certain extent. Why I bring triggers up in this is because we got to talk about how we view triggers. I am one of those people, still somewhat am. I'm overall, as much as I've worked on myself and corrected a lot of my codependent people-pleasing traits, I would rather take the energy that I have and use it to consider what I can do to prepare, and be hyper responsible and be considerate to what I know about a person, and having a conversation but what's also going to happen now is that I will prioritize saying things are important to me, because I've lived a life where there was more boisterous people than me. I'm, for the most part, pretty introverted and quiet. And I took on more of that, I'll accommodate. I'll let if they're triggered, I must have done something wrong. I must have been hurtful to them. And that's not what that means. I learned that after I went and studied to be a therapist, okay? I only learned that because I actually took the risk of trying something different and practicing what I preach. So a person's triggers, it's nearly, I will generalize here. I don't encourage people to generalize all the time, but I do believe in the theory of opposites. Generalizations that cause us negative consequences can also produce positive consequences if we use the other set of data we have to say that it's nearly impossible to avoid anyone's triggers. You don't know them, and half the time you're not going to know all of your own triggers until you start having these conversations. How I would encourage you to view triggers is your opportunity to respond to that trigger and to start the process of your healing, which is to, first and foremost, notice the trigger is happening, de-escalate your reaction, your physical central nervous system reaction to that particular stressor. And then if you're able to safely with that, and you're not experiencing any severe symptoms like suicidal thinking, extreme self-doubt, sometimes, excuse me, sometimes having a partner in this is necessary. That's why therapy exists, that you can figure out the why. What's happening, how's it happen, so you can become an expert. It's you becoming an expert on your own eggshells, is what I call them. People's triggers. I'm at the point in my life and my career where I can look at someone and how they react, and I can see the depth of their eggshells that gets lined out around them. And eggshells, sometimes they can be pretty darn sharp if you physically think about stepping on them. But a lot of times they're very fragile. And they're fragile, they cause a big reaction because that person has been so unprotected from their own standpoint for so long, because they were never taught. They were never taught how to have boundaries. They were never taught to emotionally regulate. They were never taught anything that we're just talking about. And they put all, like, it's almost it's like a crust around them. It's like, you cannot come this far or I'm going to react. It's a dog's bark, right? A dog's bark is louder than, or more hurtful than their bite. I can't remember. I just messed that up. But whatever that saying is that when someone is scared, when someone is in a fear-based or stress-based mindset and scarcity, or yeah, mostly scarcity, that they are going to be louder to keep you away because it is a defense mechanism. I'm not getting into all of the psychological defense mechanisms, which I can, but that's a whole other topic and a whole different conversation. But these eggshells are really your opportunity from the person, if you are the person doing the confronting, for you to just be aware of. Doesn't mean that you can't step on them, and it doesn't mean that you should not step on them. You're going to have to, if you're going to have a relationship with this person, and you're not going to actually regress in your own ability to have these conversations. Now, just my rule, and because this is where I deal with a lot of people who, and myself included, where we keep going back, we keep trying, we keep pouring into people that don't pour into us. We keep doing this. I have a rule of 3 when you start adopting, after you start adopting a lifestyle of recovery and intention to build your skills to be able to improve your life, is that rule of 3 is that I give myself 3 chances to address something with someone over the same topic, as long as I'm doing something different each time. If I'm saying something different, if I'm it's a different environment, it's a different time period, whatever the case may be. And if I continuously get shut down, if I continuously not because in that process, what it takes is the reflection process on my part. Be like, okay, what happened? How do I evaluate this? Yeah, my feelings got a little bit hurt because I'm still getting shut down. I control that. You don't control your feelings happening. You control what you do with them. And no one has the ability to make you feel any other way unless you give them consent. It's not quite the quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, but it is the quote. And the concept from a licensed clinical social worker, quite equivalent to a shrink also, but not a shrink. That is the only way. That is the only way that you're going to be able to overcome and address your mental health, is by sometimes having the hard conversation, but knowing that you're fully in control of how you feel, what's going on with you, and how you cope with it. Now, there are some complex cases when you're dealing with more severe trauma, but it's not any different. What you have to work towards is regaining a relationship with that control, and you have to do that by getting triggered. Have I said anything thus far that people have questions about, that people have thoughts, comments about? I love when people disagree with me. I try not to be right. Unfortunately, I do have a lot of the things. I have a lot of responses. I'm not always right, but I do always have an answer for something, and I have to be mindful of that. But there is, there are definitely circumstances that everyone's different. So I'm not speaking to just one blanket statement. Remember, is that, like, you have to take some consideration to the degree of trauma that you've experienced, to how challenging, and sometimes the trauma comes in the form of having medical issues now. Like, if you've been exposed to a lot of trauma in your life, and you have secondary consequences of, like, autoimmune disorders, pain disorders, alcoholism, substance abuse, there is going to be some more work that you got to do to be able to regain and reconnect with that degree of control over how you foresee someone makes you feel. And so it's kind of, I feel like I love a challenge. But sometimes I do this to myself, where I'm having a segmented conversation all at once. But the way that I at least make sense of that is that you may be the confronter, but at some point you're going to be the confrontee in that particular circumstance. You have triggers, and a lot of times confrontations or conflicts happen because one person doesn't acknowledge their responsibility, that they could be just as triggered as someone who's more triggerable, or that's more common to and known to be triggered than the person who usually gets triggered. And that's one of the biggest things that people overlook. So if I put that into context with this therapist relationship, if I deny the fact that I could be triggered by something that a client does or says, or the fact that I say something that could trigger them and then that could trigger me, then I am leaving myself very vulnerable to hurting the relationship and hurting myself, hurting my own mental health. Okay. So first and foremost, it's like, it's, not only just coping with the emotional regulation, but from a mind state, something that you have to really, to improve your mental health over time, you have to really internalize that you breathe the same air at any given time. When you're in this dyad and confronting someone, you have just as much responsibility for being present. It does not mean that you did something wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything's your fault, but denying that you could have influenced the situation based off of a lack of awareness on your part, that's where a lot of people get stuck. I get some client. I mean, I've never seen every single person in the world. So it's like, I have a very diverse set of clients where I've learned a lot of this and I've worked in very diverse settings. But that is probably one of the harder things to do, is when we accept that accountability, that we're present in this confrontation. We're present in that. And we may actually have done something to cause a conflict. That is not, blame is that point thrown, but that is also an automatic protection, not self-protection, self-defense mechanism. Is we project like, oh no, it's not my fault. They're the one reacting. They're the one. And that's where narcissism solidifies itself, and people place judgments on people about being certain personality things when they're doing something automatic to protect their ego. It's a stress response. But the true thing about therapy and what we work on in therapy is that you have to delay that gratification of doing the easy defense thing and actually look at the bigger picture, and in order to form those executive functioning skills to manage your emotions, to manage your response to how your triggers happen. All right. So if we go back about like triggers, right? You're never going to, it's virtually impossible to not trigger someone. If anything, actually, I was listening to a podcast today. So shout out to, what's his name? Rob Dial, the Mindset Mentor. Really good podcast if you're like wanting to continuously flood your brain with like encouraging neuro reconstructing information, the Mindset Mentor. And he talked about seeing triggers as a blessing. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. You say very similar things. I'm not sure I'd call it a blessing because it does bring hard work, but it is that opportunity for you to actually realize you can do something different. If you're not triggered, then you only have the option to stay doing the same thing, which is being comfortable. If you become uncomfortable, no, triggered is my number one trigger that I'm not sure I'll ever, I don't know, I want to solidify myself in the future, but I probably won't ever I won't give up as a trigger, is entitlement. Just because no one, my belief system, is entitled to anything that they didn't work for. But from a humanistic standpoint, no one's entitled to anything. I'm no better, no worse than anyone else in this, but I will take credit for the work that I've done on, and I've reduced a lot of my triggers. Triggers happen as much as you've done work on them. This is something too I'm practicing right now. I've worked on a lot of my triggers, but if you ever get low on energy because you lived life and had an experience that took more out of you than you could put back in, burnout, right? We go through these cycles of it. The point is to reduce the amount and expand the timeline between each burnout but our triggers can become a lot more sensitive during that time. I find myself getting irritated over really small things sometimes. And I'm like, I don't think so, Sarah. That's not worth my time. That has no value. What is that going to, if I'm going to choose this battle, right? Whether it's with myself or whether it's with another person and get back into this confrontation, that's a lot more work for me to do than I can just be like, No, I'm irritated. I'm just going to chill out for a second. I'm going to just lean back and I'm not going to go there. So these triggers are really, they're the opportunity for you to actually improve your mental health. We see them as burdensome because yeah, they take a lot out of us. Oh, hey Booker. I'm glad you made it. So when we get triggered, that is, if you can start to remind yourself that every time you're triggered, that is your moment to either practice an emotional regulation skill. If you go to my perspective counseling Instagram and on my website and my sleep challenge, I have the box breathing links for the videos, but then also some of the just a visual. Is that breathing technique is going to be and can go with you anywhere. And you can get and have other modes of coping, but this is what I learned in prison when I was working in the prison system. You can't go get a massage in prison. If not, it's not probably one that you really want, honestly. You can't go get a pedicure. You can't go outside whenever you want to. But what is with you at all times? In your lungs. Your lungs are there and with you. Your breathing is always with you. So your breath work training is one of the most powerful skills you can. I don't care if you go do yoga. I don't care if you go to the gym. Those places where you can heighten your breath work training. But if you can just start practicing breathing intentionally and holding your breath here, holding your breath for a little bit longer, you become an immensely different person just from giving yourself more oxygen. So I don't want to get too far off on breathing, but that's triggers, right? Part of confrontation culture is you're not going to be able to avoid anyone's triggers and you're not going to be able to avoid your own. So get good at dealing with them, especially in the moment when you're having these hard conversations with people. And for someone who has been like, if you're in a partnership, right, and someone becomes depressed or super anxious about something, that's naturally going to be a challenging conversation because no one's really in their right mind at that point. If they're not in a balanced state from a chemical standpoint, you can't control that, which means you can't also take on way more responsibility to avoid that and to accommodate that, but you have to be mindful of it. They're not going to react the same way they would if they have been in a more balanced state. Okay, so moving on to is kind of a part of triggers, but it's one that I am gonna encourage not only personal reflection with, but reflection on your previous confrontations, and that is the influence of shame and projection. So shame is probably one of the most overlooked. I'm not going to call it an emotion. I'm going to call it more of an experience because it's not one of the core emotions. Shame is not one of those things that like, oh, you can feel shameful, but it's more of a feeling. It's not an emotion. So when you feel shame, it's almost kind of like an automatic, Autobahn direct line to projection for a lot of people. And so when you have someone that's getting triggered or they're likely experiencing a lot of shame in that moment because you're addressing something that you don't like or that didn't work. I don't care what you say. You would really have to convince me. No one's been able to convince me anyway of this. But taking a look at yourself is one of the hardest things to do in this lifetime. I committed to it, but it is not freaking easy. I don't actually just today, I got called on being attentive to saying something that was more sensitive to how someone else was feeling about something that we've been working on. And I was like, damn, I really thought I had put a lot of intention in sharing my feedback, but I felt a little bit of shame still, and I haven't cleaned it all out. But when we feel shame, it's almost like, well, you're too sensitive. And we just go ahead and project onto like, that's someone else's problem. That's not mine. And that can be really dangerous in confrontations. And I feel like it's way more present than most people even realize, because as soon as we feel shame, we're feeling something and we become biased. We have our worldview becomes limited because we're actually experiencing shame in that moment. And then so quickly, just like that, it gets put on the other person. And so this is kind of wraps back into the triggers, is that looking at your relationship with shame is probably one of the most common denominator conversations that I have with anyone, whether it's an addict coming into recovery or whether it's someone who's like, oh, I'm just a little anxious, whether it's attention deficit disorder, whether it's bipolar disorder, is that shame is one of the best parenting tools that has been used in all these previous past generations, and it is internalized with us. And we continuously do that to provide ourselves reinforcement, and we continuously put shame on ourselves and then in turn other people, and that is ultimately what a person perceives. Now, and why I wanted to bring shame and projection together is because it's so automatic and you can't control someone else's triggers. Being mindful of your own relationship with shame, if you have one, if you deny it, first of all, I'm not going to believe you. Do some work. Make sure, because most people have a relationship with shame unless you've worked on it. And you bring shame into the conversation. If you're not aware of your own shaming, of how you hold yourself accountable, that goes and projects itself through your tone into in the arena of shared perception, and the other person receives that and in turn starts to internalize that. And if you're dealing with more of a reactive person, or someone, especially someone, if we would label them quote unquote sensitive, which be careful of that, because everyone has some sensitivities that we need to be aware of. But if you're not aware of your own individual processing of shame in that moment and it gets projected, you just created your own problem. And by all means, it's not detrimental, at least I hope it wouldn't be. But it's, for that particular confrontation, it's kind of out of your hands at this point because it got messy real quick. And that's where I encourage people to take a break. Don't try to fix something through any raised voices, any reactions. You need to kind of reset and reapproach the conversation. Okay. So more times than not, also kind of what I'm saying there is that your perception of shame is going to automatically be projected. And if someone feels shamed by you, that is actually, you may not have intended, but that may have been the impact. And we all need to take a look at like, okay, well, what could have that person perceived? Now, on the other hand, it also could be another person's relationship with shame that you're speaking to and that you're triggering unbeknownst to you, but it is still part of that process that everyone's got some skin in the game, especially in your diet, especially if you're in a triad, but it does work a little bit easier if you have a third perspective that kind of helps mediate. But a lot of the times you don't really get that. We have more dyads than we do triads, and we got thruples now, but you just want to be mindful. So I'm kind of going overboard on that. So let's bring it three-quarters of the way with the last point. And the last point I want to talk about is boundaries. Now, I said at the beginning of this, please make sure that you understand boundaries are they're ongoing process. There's the stage of learning about them, not only experiencing them, but like evaluating what boundaries you typically had, and then also what you may need to improve on and actually develop. But why boundaries comes into this conversation with confrontation culture is because the invisible boundaries of someone else's self-protection blueprints, that's what you're navigating. It reminds me of kind of, those action movies, was it Mission Impossible? Maybe where they had all those lasers, like they're breaking into a bank vault and it looks completely open and unprotected. But if you spray the cloud, aerosol, you'll start to see all the lasers. That is ultimately what you're dealing with confrontation, especially when you're trying to have a conversation with someone who struggles with anxiety, depression. Maybe you're a support system for someone with mental health. But I'm always going to encourage anyone to turn this back on yourself, because if you are a defensive person, right? If you're in self-defense mode, that's not a flex, y'all. That is you being on the lookout for threats and also in likely perceiving everything as a threat. If you learn how to protect yourself, which is learning how to know your boundaries. Boundaries are not to keep people out. They're to help keep you regulated. They're like the bumpers. I don't know, this is not a Southern thing, but I also have a lot of followers from different areas. When I grew up in the Northeast of, I'm from New Hampshire, our bowling alleys had bumpers on them. They were like these inflatable blue, like pillows for the side of the lane. That's what I encourage people to visualize boundaries as, because if we visualize boundaries as walls, that's inaccurate. That's a wall. that's keeping people out. If you want to have healthier relationships and a healthier relationship with yourself, you cannot build walls. That's to keep people out. That's your house. Now the house, like the walls are literally a type of physical boundary, but they're not necessarily the most healthy set of boundaries because they can be very rigid. So I really wanted to bring just the point about boundaries is that when you're having confrontation and you're dealing with conflict, you have a lot of those invisible boundaries that you have to form that are not going to be visual like a wall is. And first of all, I tell people to visualize a boundary as either like a chain link fence or like sometimes I use the invisible boundaries visual that I use is, if anyone's ever seen Twilight, when Bella gets her powers, she has the ability to project a boundary on and around the people that she loves. So I tell people to use that, like, this is the one person that you're trying to love and protect, right? So use that imagination to kind of build like an invisible, clear shield where you can still be seen, you can see other people, but you're protected from, the shit that they throw on you. Another reference I've used, I just used this yesterday with one of my clients, is like Rain-X. Rain-X, the outside of who you are, is like if you are picking up more people's like negative energy, negative attitude, that's a boundary that you are lacking. They are lacking it as well, but you can't control them developing their boundary. You can only control your boundary, your protection. And you're not building a wall because they can still like throw it on your wall and it gets stuck there. If you can't see that negative energy, it's still going to carry around with you. And then you're still like, you're doing more because you're going to be thinking about it. You can't get rid of it. It's literally not yours. So you got to be able to see, but you also can't see these boundaries. I know it's kind of a weird concept, but these boundaries are what we put a title on as intellectual boundaries. They're more of those, this is what helps build those neural pathways as you challenge and do stressful things and have hard conversations. Why your mental health improves is because you've now built a new pathway for you to walk in the form of a boundary as an accountability to you, not anyone else. And it's to be like, you know what? It's an indicator of like, oh, this person is moving in on my territory. And I'm known to not really like have a lot of control in the situation. So I need to be very aware of this boundary. It's an indicator. It's not a wall. I think I got that right? So let me make sure, keeping you in line with your needs rather than control. Okay, so I had made a little bit of a note here about what I want to say about boundaries. I have a note about a story version of confrontation culture. I think I wrote that when I was like planning this episode, so we'll see. So there's so many different types of experiences of like where you're going to have a confrontation with someone else's triggers, their eggshells, where shame and insecurity can really kind of, wreak havoc, and having to navigate your own boundaries and not take on too much. And one of the more recent experiences that I'd talked about with someone was this receiving of compliments, typically from a man to a woman, but doesn't have to discriminate on gender, and how we respond to them. So this was inspired by being at the gym, actually, and trying to interpret whether or not someone is giving, I'm sorry, no, that's the wrong story. I totally was just starting on the wrong story. So, oh wait, maybe it's the same story. I started thinking about this other experience when I was at Costco, and there was this woman who reacted. I'm not going to place judgment on it. She probably reacted the best way she knew how to, but when a man actually was looking at her, and I think he made a comment about her, just her presence, and um, there was this, I think, an intention of providing a compliment. I wasn't part of the situation, so don't quote me on this. But one thing I've noticed is just this interaction between someone of who you may have an uncomfortable relationship with at a completely different association. So if you don't have a very healthy relationship with men, in general, then receiving compliments from men can sometimes make you even more uncomfortable. And there's this confrontation culture, why I called this, bullet points of like, immense gratitude or points of immense, like, what am I trying to say? Points that have a lot of contention is because we've gotten to this place as individuals where we're just avoiding each other because we're scared to walk on someone's eggshells. We don't know how a woman's going to react if a man gives her a compliment. I don't know. I don't know how to tell a man of like who has trouble talking to women because he's scared of insulting her, how else to make her feel good or that he's interested without giving them and a woman an appropriate compliment. But I also do know, as a woman who's had trouble receiving compliments, I'm not a very explosive person. So that's a lot of just my natural, like some of it's training, but a lot of it is I'm more introverted. But receiving that compliment and not feeling a little insecure about it, that can get real jumbled up real freaking quick and send a different message to someone. And now that person who gave it with good intentions gave a compliment to a woman that he thought he was attractive, or a woman to another woman, or a man to another man, whatever the case may be, or a gender neutral non-binary person to another person. Like, there is so much miscommunication because, did anyone guess what I'm going to say? Because we don't have a conversation with ourselves about what makes us uncomfortable. You are in a position where you could put someone in a harmful position of having an experience that you never intended for them to do and have, because you've not taken a moment to have a conversation with yourself. And this is not, this goes for men, and what the story, what I was telling y'all about, yes, having more of a relationship and understanding, your own self and how you approach women. That could be one way to do that. But also finding that balance between, you're not ever going to be able to accommodate every single person, and everyone's at a different stage of development and in their journey, that it may not have been you. That a lot of the times gets missed within that relationship with self. And a lot of men, they just become avoidant of like, well, I'm never going to get it right. I'm never going to do this. And they become self-defeated, all because, and this is I've worked really hard to be confident and comfortable with this particular stance, is that I think women have a lot more work to do. As much as and well known as we are about our emotions, it doesn't mean we have a relationship with self that actually is fair to other people and to ourselves with those emotions. That does not automatically mean that we're emotionally intelligent. That just means you have emotions and they can be volatile. We have some work as women to do to understand ourselves, so men don't have to be in this constant state of like stress, where they can handle it, but that doesn't mean they have to. And they actually don't have to be, because the more stress they take on, the less that they can develop. And then this whole conversation about like, oh, I got to take care of a man, I got to do this, I got to take care of my partner, and is like, are they even able to address any of their own healing? So yeah, of all the things I'm trying to say is like, before you get into a relationship, please do your work. Please address your mental health. If you're already in a relationship, if you're going to couples counseling, I will always tell someone, try to have individual therapists for yourselves, and then have a place, either the same therapist of one of those people or one of the people in the couple, or having a different therapist. Sometimes having a different therapist it can be complicated but the point being is that each person, when you're having difficulties in relationships, and why most relationships fail is because you're trained, as well as you're designed, your eyes don't look inward. You're designed to see everyone else's issue and not your own. The turning inward is it's pretty scary down there. Pretty scary. It's dark. Sometimes it can be light, but then there's still like things you don't understand. So I'm gonna wrap that there and kind of tie it back around with, like, if you're doing that work on your own, it's very possible to do on your own, but I would encourage you to have perspective. That's why this exists, and having a consultation opportunity of like, hey, this is what I'm working on, but I feel like I'm missing something. When you've gotten to that point and being in tune with yourself to be like, okay, I'm kind of stuck. I'm repeating the same patterns. Getting the same outcomes. I don't want the same outcomes. It's time to look externally. And that's where therapy and where my program, where I've designed it the way that I have. When I say program, I'm not saying that you're going to come on as like an in-depth therapy client. I actually have a program that is brief, solution focused, geared on, okay, what are your goals? What are you working on your own? I can do a quick therapeutic evaluation, and from a general perspective, usually give you a different, I'm good at what I do, but I can give you a different therapeutic approach to the issue that you're dealing with. And you don't necessarily need to be every week, once a week, going to a therapist to dive deep and get all of that. Like, that is a lot of work. It's exhausting, and why a lot of people either avoid it or I just don't honestly think it's reasonable. I don't like how our system of just the traditional healthcare and concept of therapy people have become dependent on it. And my goal as an addictions counselor is to get people not dependent on other people, but interdependent, where you can have a dependence on yourself and trust and depend on someone else to be there for you because you know how to communicate your needs. Whew. I think that's all I got for you today. Oh, my coffee's cold. I was talking for 46 minutes straight. But I did tell you this particular talk was, since it was a part 2 of another one. So my course and my program, so that has different modules if you tune into this. But what happens and what you guys don't get from these lives is that I match them with specific journal entries, questions, and then also you have those brief solution focused sessions with me to work on the true internalization of this in application of confrontation culture and how it applies in your life, what the outcomes were, how to reevaluate what I was talking about before. When you take on that accountability to look at all of your conflicts, all of your relationships, not all at once, but you don't have to do it alone, and you have someone who's trained in my background is in you can Google this because it's pretty structured in this, but transactional analysis is an approach in therapy that we take and we look at the interactions and the transactions within each situation. So, and one course module that I probably won't go live on because it's a lot. I actually have a whole structure and a PowerPoint for the breakdown of this is what we call the drama triangle. So everything that we talked about today in this live, if you go back and watch it, they're dynamics within the drama triangle. There's a really good video if you download my app, which you guys can see on YouTube at the bottom of the screen. For people on Instagram, the link in my bio should have the link to the app. There is a really good video that I let people start with, or I give people to start with when it comes to the drama triangle, to give you, you can YouTube it as well. And it's an analysis. This is not something that you go and you you can tell other people about, but it's not something that you really do a whole lot with. It's to help you break down like the reflection process of like, okay, I got myself into something messy here, right? It's literally can be identified. People watching is one of my favorite things to do, like pastime. So I'll literally go down, and especially if you live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I used to love to sit on Glenwood on Friday, Saturday night and watch all the drunk people walk by, and you kind of hear some people go in their conversations, and you can, or at least I can, because maybe it's because I'm a therapist, but I can look at the interactions between people and determine each role that people are in. I'm a nerd, y'all. I'm just like, I love people enough to try to help them get different results in their lives. And that's just one of the tools that I use. But for me, it's fun. Like, as people ask me, like, what do you do for fun? You work so much. I'm like, well, I love my job. Do I have to have a little bit more fun? Like, yes, I'm actually going to be planning. Well, I had a wedding a couple weeks ago, but I want to go to an amusement park. I want to ride on a roller coaster, or like, and going to the beach or something like that. But I'm pretty low key when it comes to fun because I actually have built fun in to my lifestyle because I worked on my mental health. I see my work as fun because I like to make people laugh. Like I have fun with my clients. So yeah, your fun is your own perspective. But it is a very important part about confrontation too, because not all confrontations and conflicts have to end in a messy, uncomfortable way. Okay. So because I can continuously talk for more than necessary, I'm going to cap it here. I don't see any questions like in the chat, but before I go, and I'll change the caption so you guys know, my website is sarawilderlcsw.com. And up there, I guess the highlights there are, so I've got my merch and my store up. There's only like 3 things in it right now because I'm waiting on the final product development pictures to post, and then I'll be posting them to Instagram a little bit more. I also have my app up there right now. It's the free version, but my programs are live. So the subscription, what I was just telling y'all about, you can go sign up for, and I'm doing my consultations are open. And then, yeah, basically we get you kind of on like an automated, but then also check in on a treatment plan of like, this is what you're working on, so I can help you hold you accountable to finishing and completing your goals and taking those next steps within how you improve your life and ultimately improve your mental health. So, what else is up there? My blog is up there. So I've been having a couple of blog posts. That's kind of where I debut like how you keep up with Sara. I don't actually post everything on social media because not everyone understands the impact of it. So if you follow my blog, then you can kind of see the consistency of not only just topics of conversation, but like what I'm up to. What else is on my website? I think that's about, it's it. My story's up there, but I'll be writing that book too as well. So a little bit more detailed. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. If anyone has any questions, you can either respond in the comments when I post this. And yeah, I think I'm going to sign off on that. But I hope you guys have a great weekend. Get some rest. Or get outside, getting some vitamin D because it's been raining all week in Raleigh. I'm going to be getting outside a little bit, and I have clients tomorrow. So I hope you guys have a really great weekend, and hopefully you guys enjoy this.